Hello there. This is Pastor Amy, and thank you for joining me as we continue with our Fully Engaged Bible study videos. I hope these videos have been a helpful tool as we've read through the New Testament together. Today, we're starting a new book. We are in the Gospel of Luke, and gospel, you may already know, just means good news. So we're hearing the good news about Jesus' life on earth. As I said last time I did a video, anytime we start a new book, if you have a study Bible, it's helpful to read that introduction page and get the background information about it. But I'll share a little bit of those details now as well. We don't know a lot about the author of Luke. He's referred to a few times in New Testament letters as one of the co-workers working to spread the church. And he also wrote the book Acts of Apostles, which we'll read this summer, that talks about that work, starting the new church. We hear Luke referred to as the beloved physician, so we do know that he was a doctor. And in the very beginning of Luke, we're here that he wrote the book in order to have an orderly account of Jesus' life. So that's what Luke tries to provide for us. I'll just mention a few themes you'll notice in the book of Luke. One thing we see is a lot of connections to the Old Testament and to the Jewish faith. It's very important to Luke that he connects Jesus as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. But in the midst of that, Luke also has a heart for the outsider and those outside of the Jewish faith. So we see Jesus reaching out to all people and all of creation, and that important message that Jesus is a Messiah for the whole world, and that it was the role of the Jewish faith of the Israel people to be a light for all nations to know God's love. Another thing you'll notice in Luke is a real concern for the poor. We're going to hear a lot about our call to take care of the least among us. And then one fun thing about the book of Luke is there is lots of meals. Jesus is often eating and drinking with others. And I think this is really because when we sit down and share food and share drink, we are sharing life together. So we get to see Jesus sharing life with lots of different people in the book of Luke. But today we are focused on the first chapter of Luke. And right now is the perfect time to be in chapter 1 of Luke because it is the season of Advent. And this is the build up to Christmas. This is where we get the history and background of the birth of both Jesus and John the Baptist. And this chapter is just filled with so much hope and expectation and joy. So it's a great thing to be reading right now. You might want to divide up the reading so you can do a little each day as your daily devotion because it fits so well with the Advent season. The book of Luke starts not with Jesus, but with the birth of John the Baptist being foretold. And we meet John's parents, Elizabeth and Zechariah, and we hear that they are both good, faithful people, but that they haven't been able to have a child. And we'll hear later that especially for Elizabeth, this was a source of shame and disgrace, and that she was treated probably differently because she wasn't able to have a baby. But we start with Zechariah, who is a priest and is in the temple doing his priestly duties when the angel of the Lord, Gabriel, comes upon him, and he gives him this message from verse 13. "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayers have been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth." The angel will continue to go on and talk about who John will be and what he will do and this important role he has as a prophet foretelling Jesus' ministry. I want to also point out that the angel begins the message with the words, "Do not be afraid." These are common words of assurance. They're found often in the Bible, and we're going to hear them quite a bit in the book of Luke. I like to say each time we hear "do not be afraid," it usually means that there are good reasons to be afraid. And it's that reminder that we have God's presence and God is bigger even than these things we have to be afraid of. After the angel shares this message with Zechariah, he has this moment of what I like to say, be careful what you ask for, because Zechariah asks probably what we would all say, how can this be? How will I know this will happen? Elizabeth is quite old. How can we have a baby now? And Gabriel answers, if me, the angel of the Lord, standing here in front of you is not enough of a sign, well, then I can give you another sign. You won't be able to speak until all of these things come to pass. I like to have a little fun with that, but I do think it sounds kind of harsh to us that he asks this question that we all would ask and loses the power to speak. But I wonder if there wasn't some kind of gift and blessing to Zechariah being mute during this time. Because he isn't able to speak, no one knows the message that Gabriel has shared with him yet. So Zechariah gets some time to think and reflect and get ready, not just to have a baby, but to have a baby who's going to play such an important role in God's plan. And we see later, when Zechariah gets his voice back, he's able to proclaim this beautiful hymn of praise and talk about everything that God has done and God will do. So we can tell this is time where Zechariah really gets to think about what's going to happen and how his son plays a role in God's plan. But before we get to that, Gabriel then has another birth to foretell. So we hear that he also appears to Mary, and we hear that Mary is a young woman and that she's engaged to be married to Joseph, who is descended from David. And right when the angel comes to Mary, he greets her as a highly favored one. And Mary, we hear, is confused by this greeting. She wonders why an angel would call her, a young, unimportant girl, highly favored. But of course, we know that Mary has found favor in the Lord. And again, the angel Gabriel starts with those familiar words, do not be afraid. And then he goes on to tell Mary about who Jesus will be and what Jesus will do. And in this message, we hear those ties back to the Old Testament and to that awaited Messiah, someone who's going to be like King David and bring glory to Israel. So all of this is foretold to Mary, and she also asks, how will this be? Gabriel is gentler with her. He explains how this will happen, and then he gives her this wonderful word of promise that with God, all things are possible, that nothing will be impossible with God. And then in verse 38, Mary says, here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. And I love that verse right there. This is Mary's powerful yes, her agreement that she is going to be part of all that was foretold to her. And we just hear that Mary is in, and she's going to be a part of this. Right after this, we hear that Mary goes with haste to visit her cousin Elizabeth. So Mary and Elizabeth are connected, related in that way. We kind of can speculate there were a couple reasons that Mary went to see Elizabeth. The first is that she was in a very dangerous predicament. To be a woman who is not married but pregnant could be punished by death. So she may have been going to Zechariah and Elizabeth for some safety. But I also just love that she has Elizabeth to go to, and that these two women get to be together during this special time. They have both heard miraculous messages from angels. They are both pregnant and expecting these amazing babies. So how wonderful that they get to be together during this time, and they have each other to support and comfort one another. And not only do they support each other, I think these women really preach the gospel to each other. And this starts with Elizabeth. As soon as she sees Mary, she gives her this blessing that we find in verse 42. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leapt for joy. And blessed is she who believed that this would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord. I just imagine that this had to be so powerful for Mary to hear. First of all, it must have made it real in a whole new way to have someone else acknowledge what the angel had told her and say, yes, this is going to happen. And then how powerful to hear that word of blessing, that Mary is blessed because she believed that all of this would happen. And it's just such a gift that Elizabeth gives to Mary. And then Mary continues on here to lift up her voice in this hymn of praise. I like to say that the end of Luke 1 is kind of like a musical where people just suddenly burst out in song. I don't know if Mary actually sang at this time, but these words she shared have become the Magnificat, a beautiful hymn of praise that we often sing during this time of year. In Mary's song, we hear ties back to the Old Testament as well. Mary is lifting up words from 1 Samuel. These words were first sung by Hannah. Hannah was another woman who struggled to have a child and was in deep despair, not being able to have a baby. But God promised that she would have a child, and these are the words of praises she lifts up after her child Samuel is born. So Mary's pulling from that tradition. And then also in Mary's song, we hear themes that we're going to hear throughout the Gospel of Luke, and themes that are going to be really important in Jesus' ministry on earth. So the first one that we hear is this promise that those who have been faithfully waiting for God will keep, and God will keep those ancient promises of a Messiah, that will be fulfilled. We also hear of the repair of damage to creation. And then we hear of this reordering of the world, that the powerful are going to be brought down, the lowly are going to be lifted up, the hungry will be fed, the rich will be sent away empty. So this is such an important message, and we'll hear that throughout Jesus' preaching as well. During this time of year, you may have heard the song, Mary, Did You Know? It's asking the question if Mary knew when Jesus was born all the things that would happen. And I think it's a beautiful song, but every time I hear it, I want to say, yes, Mary knew. We hear right in the Magnificat, right in these verses, that Mary had a very deep understanding of who Jesus was going to be and a deep understanding of God's justice and mercy, and that God's justice was so important to her. I encourage you to take a little time, maybe right now, pull up the Magnificat on YouTube so you can listen to it, or even better, attend our Wednesday night Advent services. We're using the service, hold an evening prayer, and in that service we sing a beautiful version of the Magnificat. These are wonderful words, but they're even better when you get to hear them to music, so I encourage you to do that. And then we get one more song of praise here in the first chapter. We go back to the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah, and we hear that their son is born, and on his 8th day of life, they bring him to the temple as is custom to be named and circumcised. Zechariah still can't talk, but there must have been a way that he communicated some of the message to Elizabeth, because she said the baby is to be named John. The people don't agree with her. It's tradition to use a family name. They said we should name him Zechariah. She insists on John, so they still don't feel comfortable with that, so they bring Zechariah a writing tablet, and he's able to write the baby's name is John. And in this moment, in this naming of John, he gets his power of speech back, and he too lifts up this beautiful song of praise. And in his song, we hear that he blesses God. He promises that the hope for the Messiah is going to be realized. And then he sings to his son John about the role he's going to play as a prophet. It's another beautiful song. It's great to take a moment to listen to that. We often call this song the Benedictus. So it's another just wonderful hymn of blessing that we get from the first chapter of Luke. And then as the first chapter wraps up, we hear that John has grown strong, and we leave him in the wilderness, and we're going to connect to John again in chapter 3, but first we'll hear the birth of Jesus in chapter 2. I hope this video was helpful to you, and again, I hope that this reading is a blessing on your Advent season, and really helps you get into the spirit of those Advent themes of waiting with hope and expectation. Thank you.